Hi guys, and welcome back. Tonight, before sleep gently closes over your eyes, we will travel very far together, farther than the first cities, farther than the pages of history written in ink, farther even than the memories humankind has managed to preserve through storytelling. We will return to a world of ice, wind, dried lake beds, and untamed wilderness, when America was still a vast and silent expanse, and the traces of human beings had only just begun to touch the cold earth. Tonight's story does not begin with a king, an empire, or a famous battle, but with something far more fragile, a footprint, a small footprint of a child, a larger footprint of an adult, very ordinary, very quiet steps pressed into the shore of an ancient lake at White Sands, New Mexico. And yet those very steps, asleep for tens of thousands of years beneath layers of sand and time, are now telling us one of the greatest stories about the origins of humankind in the Americas. Tonight, we will follow those footprints back into the Ice Age, crossing Beringia, the lost land between Asia and America, walking among the shadows of mammoths, giant sloths, the cutting winds, and the journeys in which every step could become a boundary between survival and disappearance. So, before we begin, try letting your shoulders soften just a little. Breathe in very slowly, and then breathe out gently. And if you are listening with me tonight, leave a small greeting in the comments, along with the name of the city or country where you are listening from. And now, let the sounds of the long day drift quietly away, and together, let us step into the story of the first people of the Americas. Imagine that night has fallen into its deepest hour. Every familiar sound of the present has receded behind you, and before your eyes there is no longer a world of asphalt roads, electric lights, or brightly glowing cities. In their place is a land so vast that the gaze can scarcely find a stopping point, an ancient lakeshore lying in the heart of New Mexico, where cold wind skims across shallow water and soft mud still holds the imprint of whoever has just passed by. There is no loud human speech, no name carved into stone, only a low sky, damp earth, and footsteps still very fresh along the edge of the lake, in the place we now call White Sands. The landscape of tens of thousands of years ago was not the white sea of gypsum dunes we see today, but a system of lakes, wetlands, and muddy shores surrounding ancient Lake Otero. An environment wet enough to preserve footprints and then bury them beneath fine layers of sediment for an extraordinarily long span of time. And within that stillness, let us look a little more closely. Perhaps there was an older person there, or an adolescent already strong enough to bear the responsibilities of adulthood. Beside them was a small child, with shorter, lighter steps, at times clearly visible, at times disappearing, as though the child had been lifted and carried across a difficult, muddy stretch. White Sands does not preserve only scattered footprints. Here, researchers have described a very long, fossilized trackway in which the footprints of a larger person traveling with a child appear on the surface of ancient mud, suggesting a strangely ordinary moment. Not kings, not warriors, but simply someone trying to guide a child across a patch of wet ground. It is that very ordinariness that makes the discovery so haunting. because it makes the past cease to be something abstract. It becomes a living moment, soft, almost still warm. What makes White Sands extraordinary is not merely the fact that ancient footprints exist there. There are many places in the world where traces of early humans have been found. But here, the footprints are not a secondary detail attached to a larger site. They are the story itself. They are direct evidence that someone once stood upon that ground, crossed it, slipped lightly in the mud, shifted the weight of their body onto one foot, and then lifted it again to move forward. Scientists do not see a complete skeleton or a ceremonially buried grave. They see something far more intimate, the rhythm of a life that has passed away. The NPS has described the presence of humans and large animals at White Sands as being known chiefly not from bones or tools, but from fossilized footprints preserved within ancient lake sediments. It is rare, perhaps, for human history to appear through something so fragile, a single step that still retains the shape of the foot, the heel, the arch, the toes, and then lies motionless through millennia. We often imagine history as beginning with things that are large, a fortress wall, a tomb, a city, a sword buried with the dead. But White Sands does the opposite. It begins with one small footprint, then another, then a long line of quiet steps that no one alive at the time could ever have imagined would one day become one of the most astonishing pieces of evidence in the archaeology of the Americas. When a study published in 2021 proposed that some of the human footprints at White Sands were around 21,000 to 23,000 years old, it immediately shook the familiar model of when humans first appeared in North America. An analysis in Nature at the time emphasized that if that date held, then human beings had been in the Americas thousands of years earlier than many scientists had widely accepted. But the beauty of science does not lie in how easily it believes something astonishing. Its beauty lies in its slowness, its rigor, and at times its coldness. After the initial publication, the White Sands dates were immediately debated. The reason is easy to understand. 21,000 to 23,000 years is far too important a claim to accept on excitement alone. Part of the original dating relied on the seeds of aquatic plants found in sediment layers associated with the footprints. And there were concerns that an old carbon effect in the water could make the samples appear older than they really were. Then, in 2023, a follow-up study published by the USGS used two additional, independent lines of verification, including dating from terrestrial pollen and luminescence dating of quartz grains, and both reinforced the same general age range. Not every debate vanished after that, but the balance of evidence leaned much more strongly toward the conclusion that humans truly were present at White Sands during the last glacial maximum. And that is the moment when the story suddenly becomes far deeper. Because if those footprints were truly pressed into the mud 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, then the people who left them did not simply live in the past. They lived in a past unimaginably remote, in the midst of the coldest climatic phase of the late Ice Age, when colossal ice sheets still shaped both the routes open to humans and the fate of the great animals of the time. Pause for a moment on that image. A child, a larger companion, a lakeshore, and all around them, a world we know today only through geology, fossils, and reconstructed models. At this point, White Sands gives the listener a very strange feeling. the feeling that history is no longer resting on a bookshelf. It is right beneath our feet, in mud, in water, in the low light of a day that passed tens of thousands of years ago. If you were standing at White Sands today, you would see brilliant white gypsum dunes spread out like snow. But the landscape we need to imagine tonight is entirely different. Back then, this place was the shore of ancient Lake Otero and the marshlands around it. The water was not always deep. In some places there was soft mud, in others, damp ground just firm enough to hold a footprint with striking clarity. And for that very reason, these traces are both a gift and something profoundly fragile. The NPS notes that the fossilized footprints at White Sands are easily exposed and then quickly destroyed by wind and erosion. Some have disappeared only a short time after coming to the surface. When you think of that, the discovery of White Sands feels even more like a door opening for a brief instant. Time allows us to look into a scene unimaginably old, and then may close again at any moment if we fail to record it in time. Perhaps that is why these footprints reach the listener in a way that stone artifacts or animal bones do not. A tool tells us about skill. A tooth or bone fragment tells us about presence. But a footprint tells us about movement. It preserves a moment that is brief and deeply human. You can almost measure the pace of the walk. You can imagine how slippery the ground must have been. You can guess that at times the child was set down, at times lifted up again, and at times the larger figure had to force their foot free from the mud. None of that turns inference into certainty, but it brings archaeology closer to lived experience. And that is exactly what makes White Sands so unusual. It allows modern people not only to know that someone once lived, but also to feel, in some small way, how they moved through an afternoon long ago, in a world that had no idea it would one day be called prehistory. The silence of White Sands is also part of the story, because these footprints do not speak for themselves. They have no writing. They do not tell us the name of the walker, the reason for the journey, or what waited at the end of the path. Was someone hurrying? Was someone carrying a child to safety? Was someone simply walking from one edge of the lake to the other? We do not know. And perhaps it is precisely that empty space that makes this first chapter so suited to a night's listening before sleep. Because sometimes what holds a listener is not a complete answer, but the feeling of standing very close to a mystery that still seems warm with human presence. We are not looking at a legend. We are looking at evidence. And yet that evidence is soft enough to preserve the blurred edges of life. The way water at night reflects the sky while never fully revealing the bottom of the lake. And then, as researchers continued to study the site, White Sands revealed not only isolated human footprints, it is a mega-track site, a place extraordinarily rich in Pleistocene fossil footprints, with humans and many large animals present within the same ancient landscape. The NPS notes that White Sands holds one of the largest collections of Ice Age fossil footprints in the world, and that alongside human tracks are those of mammoths, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, American lions, and other creatures. Even so, in this chapter, what we need to carry with us is not the confrontation between humans and beasts. What we need to keep is the underlying feeling. They were not walking across an empty earth. They were walking through a living world, vast and real, a world in which human presence was written into the ground alongside the movements of other species, as though the entire landscape had once been a sheet of wet paper. And for a brief span of time, every creature that passed over it had accidentally signed its name. There is something very beautiful in the way White Sands forces us to rethink the word evidence. Usually, we wait for an artifact that is hard, heavy, durable, something that can be held in the hand. But here, the evidence is the softest thing of all, mud. Mud receives the weight of a body for a few seconds. Then wind, water, sediment, and time do the rest, tens of thousands of years later. Modern humans bend down and realize that history has been preserved not by intention, but by a strange accident of climate, geology, and a short journey made by someone whose name we will never know. Perhaps that is why White Sands moves people more deeply than they expect archaeology to do, because what appears here is not only great antiquity. What appears is the fragility of life, and at the same time, the astonishing endurance of traces. A person may disappear, a language may fall silent, but a single footprint, if it meets the right ground, the right layer of mud, the slow right hand of time, can remain long enough to awaken an entire continent of memory. And perhaps the most moving thing of all is this: those footprints were never made to send a message to the future. No one walked along that lakeshore intending to leave a sign for us. There was no solemn ritual. No one turned back to make sure history had noticed them. They simply lived, simply walked, simply carried a child, or led them, or set them down for a while in the mud and then lifted them again. Yet it is precisely that lack of intention that makes the discovery feel more truthful than any legend. We are not hearing a civilization tell its own story. We are hearing the earth retell an unstaged moment. And because of that, it feels almost painfully believable. The history of the Americas, at this opening point, does not come to us through drums, the blare of horns, or the names of great leaders. It comes through the quietest sound of all. Footsteps so soft that only after everything else has fallen silent for tens of thousands of years can we finally hear them. So tonight, if you wish, keep in your heart the simplest image from this first chapter. You do not need to remember every dating method by name. You do not need to hold on to every stage of the debate. You need only remember that at White Sands, on the shore of an ancient, vanished lake, human footprints were once pressed into damp earth in a time unimaginably far away. And those footprints, after a silence longer than any spoken memory, have returned to remind us that the story of humans in the Americas may begin earlier, more quietly, and more movingly than anyone once imagined. A child, a larger companion, a lakeshore, a world cold and wide, and within all that immensity. The first evidence was not a proclamation. It was only a few small steps, yet enough to make all of history stop and look down at the ground. This chapter opens in the low glow of a fire, in a night far colder than any night familiar to us. The silent lakeshore is gone now. Gone, too, are the footsteps of a child walking beside an adult. Here, across a cold stretch of grassland at the end of the Ice Age. The air carries the scent of freshly broken stone, of animal hide dried by smoke, of smoke itself clinging to hair and fur garments. Dawn has not fully arrived. The wind still moves across the open ground, and at the edge of the firelight, a man is bent over a long stone core, his hands working very slowly, very steadily, as though he is not merely shaping a tool, but placing the entire life of his group into each final, delicate flake he removes. We cannot know exactly what his face looked like. No one can hear his voice anymore. But from what remains at Clovis sites, we know that these people left behind long, slender stone points, with a flute-like channel struck upward from the base, what we now call fluted points. And these became the most distinctive signature of Clovis across North America. The first Clovis points were found alongside the bones of extinct large animals near Clovis, New Mexico, and Blackwater Draw became the type site forever associated with that name. The fire throws a thin, gentle light across the surface of the stone. The craftsman turns the point in his hand, looking along its length the way one might look along a narrow branch of bone. From the first rough stone blank, he has removed so much that was unnecessary, layer by layer, flake by flake, until at last a leaf-like form has emerged. But the most important part still remains for the very end. A strike too hard, and the entire point could split in two. A strike too soft, and it will not reach the thinness needed to hold securely in its shaft. Then, at precisely the right moment, a long flake is detached from the base, running upward through the body of the point and leaving behind the distinctive channel. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would call this fluting, a way of thinning the base to make hafting easier. That is, attaching the stone point to a spear shaft. But on that night, beside that fire, no one called it by any name at all. They only knew that if it was done correctly, the point would go deeper, hold more firmly, and the chance of returning with meat, fat, bone, and marrow would be greater. We often imagine mammoth hunters as shadowy figures recklessly charging straight toward colossal creatures amid roars and chaos. But the truth is colder than that, slower than that, and demands far more patience. Clovis does not leave behind the feeling of fury. It leaves behind the feeling of preparation at sites associated with Clovis, beyond the points themselves. There are knives, blades struck from cores, scrapers, and toolkits that show this was not a culture concerned only with the final throw. Before the moment of confronting an animal that weighs several tons, there are hours of watching the wind, the ground, the paths of movement, the softness of mud, the position of water, the way a herd stops, turns, and divides. A great hunt does not begin with running. It begins with silence. Perhaps the dawn that day came very slowly. On the horizon, pale gray light gradually separated the grass from the sky, and in the distance, like dark masses of earth moving of their own accord, the mammoths appeared. Not a lone creature, as in an illustration, but a living mass with its own rhythm, with calves and adults, with enormous bodies moving heavily yet never clumsily, never helplessly slow. They know which ground is soft, which water is deep, which wind carries an unfamiliar scent. A creature like that is not something humans confront head-on for the sake of courage. It is a problem of time, terrain, and nervous endurance. Clovis sites connected with butchering or processing large animals are often found near water. And in some older NPS archaeological overviews, there is mention of the possibility that humans used marshy ground, bog traps, or difficult terrain to diminish the advantage of large prey. That does not make the hunt any less dangerous. It simply shows that these hunters did not prevail through brute force alone. They prevailed, if the word may be used, by reading the landscape better than the animal they pursued. Perhaps at the edge of some water, one man had stood for a very long time, simply watching, not watching the animal itself, but watching where its foot sank, only slightly. A step that went deeper than usual, a shift in direction, a calf standing too close to the water, an adult turning more slowly when the wind changed. On that cold grassland, hunting was not a matter of throwing oneself into the fiercest moment. Hunting was keeping one's patience long enough for that moment to arrive of its own accord. And when it did, it was not beautiful in any heroic sense. It was sudden, filthy, full of mud and hot breath. One small sound could bunch the whole herd together. The ground trembled. No one in the hunting party could forget that a single wrong step could turn their own body into something crushed beneath the feet of a wounded animal. Perhaps the first spears did not kill it at once. Perhaps none of them could. Clovis points, however long and beautiful, were not magic. They did not erase the enormous distance between a human body of flesh and bone and the towering, fur-covered body of an Ice Age beast. What they offered was only a chance to slow it, a chance to make it lose blood, a chance for the pursuit to begin leaning, little by little, toward whichever side could endure longer. Even today, there is still much debate over exactly how Clovis people use those points. But fluted Clovis points have long been closely bound to the image of hunting large game. And some of the most famous earliest discoveries were found among ribs, or near the remains of extinct animals. Sites such as Blackwater Draw became iconic because they show not only that humans were present, but that they were present in the world of mammoths. Perhaps the hunt did not end where it began. A wounded mammoth does not collapse like a deer. It keeps moving, dragging the tension of the human group behind it, through low grass, through muddy ground, through patches of cold standing water like metal. The man who shaped the point the night before is no longer a craftsman now. Now he runs, stops, leans to listen, then runs again. Somewhere beside him are others, not many, perhaps only a small group, coordinating in gestures briefer than speech. Some older archaeological interpretations imagined Clovis groups as small, mobile, and using high-quality stone brought from very great distances. That suggests not only movement, but also memory of roots, of places where stone could be found, where water lay, where herds returned with the seasons. And then, finally, the animal begins to slow. That moment can hardly have looked glorious. It is the moment when breathing grows heavier. The hind legs begin to slacken, the head lowers slightly, and that mass of strength that seemed inexhaustible begins to show that it has limits after all. The hunters stand farther back now, wider around it, knowing that the danger has not yet left them. A wounded animal is often more frightening than a healthy one. because pain can make it turn with one last violent burst. But when it truly falls, the whole landscape seems to fall quiet with it. The wind still blows, the grass still leans, warmth still rises from the enormous body lying before them, and from that moment onward, the hunt becomes a different kind of labor, longer, harder, and perhaps even more important than the act of bringing the animal down. Because a mammoth is not merely a trophy, it is food, fat, marrow, bone, ivory, hide, sinew. A study published in Science Advances in 2024 suggested that in the West, mammoth may have been the largest component of the Clovis diet, surpassing elk, bison, and camel. In other words, for some Clovis communities. Mammoth was not simply a giant beast in the memory of the hunt. It was truly a central source of protein in daily life. That makes the scene after the hunt immediately clear. This is not an encounter for honor. It is an event the whole group will live from. Imagine the afternoon gradually descending over the body of the fallen animal. Hands numbed by cold, yet never ceasing their work. Stone knives cutting through the thick hide. The remaining heat from within the body rising into the freezing air. The fat is carefully kept. The best cuts of meat must be separated first. The large bones will later be broken for marrow. The sinews will become binding cords. The bones may become tools. The ivory, if still whole enough, is a resource greater than a single meal. Nothing is wasted on a grassland like this. There is no place here for empty romance, only for quiet gratitude toward whatever can still be used. And at the edge of that scene, there may be children, not standing too close, not pushing between those who are cutting meat and separating joints, but close enough to see and to learn. If White Sands leaves us with the image of a child once stepping through mud beside an adult, then Clovis leaves us with the ability to imagine a world in which the skills of survival were passed on not through lectures, but by standing beside the fire and watching older hands do each necessary task. How to lash a stone point to a shaft, how to keep a sharp edge from chipping, how to cut along a joint, how to bring meat back before the cold deepens. A culture does not survive because of one successful hunt. It survives because those skills continue into the next day, when night returns. The hunting camp may no longer resemble the place where they slept the evening before. Now there is the added smell of blood, of fat dripping into the fire, of freshly stripped hide. The firelight no longer shines on an unused point. It shines on tools that have already done the work required of them. Someone may be sitting, repairing a spear shaft, someone sharpening the edge of a knife, someone drying meat, someone else simply staring into the red coals, both hands stretched out before them as though trying to recover feeling in fingers numbed by the day's pursuit. And somewhere beyond that little ring of light, the darkness of the Ice Age remains as thick as ever, still holding other creatures, other hungers, other failed hunts yet to come. What makes the Clovis people appear so powerfully in the imagination is not that they were warriors in the later sense of history. They left us no fortress walls, no thrones, no names. What they left was a quieter kind of quality, the precision of the hand, the endurance of a small group in a vast space, and the ability to place intelligence into objects small enough to rest in the palm. A Clovis point, considered by itself, is beautiful. But its beauty is not the beauty of something made merely to be admired. It is the beauty of something born under the pressure of survival, where a single channel at the base of a stone point might determine whether the spear would still hold fast when it struck a gigantic body. And perhaps that is the image that should remain with us as this chapter closes. Not the moment the mammoth falls, though that is its largest scene, but the much earlier moment when a man sits beside the fire at night, lifts the stone point to eye level, turns it beneath the glow of embers, and knows that tomorrow the entire group will place its trust in this small thing. Out there is a world of cold grass, dark water, and bodies many times larger than a human being. But within the narrow ring of firelight, amid the almost inaudible snapping sound of newly broken stone, we see what truly helped them endure, not a strength greater than the world, but a patience deep enough to read it, wait for it, and live alongside it. Tonight, if you wish to keep one sound from this chapter before moving on, keep that sound. Not the roar of a mammoth, not the pounding of footsteps in pursuit across the cold grass, but the sound of a thin stone flake breaking free beneath a precise touch in the hand of a Clovis craftsman, somewhere in late Ice Age America, while dawn has not yet come, and the whole life of the group tomorrow still lies gathered within the small flame before him. Let the fire from the previous night sink very low, until only a small, trembling circle of light remains in the cold wind. And then, from the edge of that light, look a little farther outward, far enough that the darkness is no longer an empty space, but a world that is breathing. Ice Age North America was not a barren land waiting for human beings to enter it. It was already full of the heavy footfalls of giant herds, full of hot breath rising into the cold air, full of eyes that flared to life and vanished again in the dark grass. It was a continent of megafauna, of bodies so immense that even the landscape itself seemed to yield to them. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, American lions, camels, and the ancient horses that once crossed lands which today are only desert, prairie, or white dunes. Even the Tularosa Basin of white sands was once a place where such creatures left their tracks beside the footprints of human beings. If you were standing within that world, the first thing you would likely feel would not be grandeur, but scale. Human beings would suddenly become very small. Not small in the poetic sense of humility, but small in the physical sense. A slender, breakable body, a quick-beating heart, skin not thick enough to withstand the cold without fire, bones that could not survive the sideways blow of an animal weighing several tons, and all around them stretched a continent where life often came in astonishing size. A herd of mammoths crossing damp ground could press the entire earth deep beneath their weight. A single giant ground sloth, standing upright, could darken the brush before it as though a colossal door had swung shut against the sky. A saber-toothed cat lying motionless in the shadow of low brush could turn the whole grassland ahead into a place no one would want to turn their back on for long. Mammoths always arrive first in the imagination, perhaps because they carry a grandeur that is almost impossible to mistake. Look at a herd moving through the gray light of early morning. Not one, but many, like fur-covered hills drifting slowly across damp grassland. Every footfall lands with a deep, muffled weight against the earth every time they stop. The air around them seems to grow still in late Pleistocene North America. Mammoths were a core part of the megafaunal world, and across many regions of the continent, fossils show them living alongside ancient camels, ancient horses, bison, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. These were not a few rare creatures scattered thinly across the land. This was an entire world full of large bodies that consumed much, traveled far, and left deep traces not only in the ground, but in the very structure of the landscape. But mammoths were not only large, they also carried an ancient feeling, as though they belonged to a rhythm of time different from that of human beings. Their long, curved tusks like old crescents of moon, their massive shoulders, their heavy heads lowered as they swept aside thin snow, mud, or dry grass in search of food. When a mammoth moved through shallow water, the surface did not simply ripple. It was churned, muddied, transformed into a broken mirror, reflecting a sky dissolving beneath the feet of that gigantic animal. And if a small group of humans had to watch them from afar, surely the first thing striking them would not have been the opportunity to hunt, but the weight of the world itself. There are creatures that seem as though they cannot be stopped. There are creatures that make the mere thought of approaching them an act demanding nerves of steel. And yet, even when your eyes move away from the mammoth herd, that world becomes no less frightening. At the edge of the grassland, in lower ground, among sparse brush, or beside the carcass of a recently dead animal, there may be the shape of a saber-toothed cat emerging. It does not need to be as numerous as the mammoths to dominate the scene. All it requires is one low, powerful body, thick-shouldered, moving with a heavy softness, and two long teeth catching the light as it tilts its head. In the modern imagination, saber-tooths are often turned into pure monsters. But what makes them more terrifying than anything else is their silence. They are not noisy like wolves. They do not make the ground tremble like mammoths. They arrive like a dark thought appearing at the edge of vision and then standing still, close enough to see the weight in the shoulders, far enough that no one can tell how long they have already been watching. Saber-toothed cats truly lived alongside mammoths and giant ground sloths in the final world of the Ice Age. And their fossils are one of the striking parts of the North American megafaunal picture. And then there is the giant ground sloth, perhaps the most unsettling creature of all if one were to meet it on some distant ancient lakeshore. For it does not resemble the familiar ferocity of the imagination. It does not roar, does not charge, does not carry a gleaming row of long, cold fangs. Its vastness comes in a slower, stranger, almost surreal form. Imagine a heavy, fur-covered body, powerful forelimbs, great curved claws, walking with a pace both slow and steady, as though every joint in its body were too ancient to have any need for haste. If it rose upright, it could tower astonishingly high, becoming a giant dark mass among brush or beside marshland. The NPS describes the giant ground sloth as one of the characteristic large Ice Age animals at White Sands, and it too belonged to the list of megafauna that crossed many parts of North America before vanishing at the end of the Ice Age. around 10,000 years ago. If the mammoth gives the feeling of the Earth's weight, and the saber-toothed cat gives the feeling of death arriving out of shadow, then the giant ground sloth brings another kind of strangeness entirely. The sense that nature at that time was still experimenting with forms the later world would not keep. Perhaps a human group saw its claw marks in the mud before they saw the creature itself. Perhaps they saw the broad, round tracks of mammoths layered over the damp earth, and then other tracks besides, deep but stranger, as though something heavy had passed through that looked like nothing they had ever hunted. White Sands today is one of the rare places that has preserved such crossings on the earth itself. Human tracks, mammoth tracks, ground sloth tracks, and the traces of many other species overlapping one another within the same landscape. And that is perhaps what makes Ice Age North America so cinematic that it scarcely needs embellishment. It did not merely contain large animals. It contained large animals living together, in the same morning, at the same body of water. A mammoth herd may have come down to drink. A ground sloth may have moved slowly through the mud. Dire wolves may have scented the edges. A saber-toothed cat may have been hidden in lower ground, and somewhere among all of it, very small human beings may have been watching from a distance just sufficient to survive. At Joshua Tree, Tule Springs, White Sands, and many other places, fossils and traces reveal a long list of megafauna that once shared the North American landscape. Columbian mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, camels, horses, bison, American lions. A continent like that was never empty. It was crowded in a way far more primal and violent than the present. Night in that world must have been deeper than any night we know. There were no villages stretching to the horizon, no glowing windows, no mechanical sounds washing over every silence. Only wind, sparse insect noise, fire, and every now and then a sound enough to make everyone around the campfire lift their heads at once. It might have been the splash of water stirred hard by an enormous body descending to the lake's edge. It might have been the sound of a herd changing direction in the dark. It might have been a low, brief growl, then silence again. In such a world, sleep can never have been entirely deep. You lay down, but part of the nervous system remained awake, still listening, still measuring the distance between yourself and whatever was moving out there. The first people in North America did not live upon a stage they had built. They lived inside a world where they were only one of many creatures forced to negotiate with darkness. And by daylight, things were a little gentler. Grassland, marsh, dry lake beds, muddy shores, scattered groves, valleys opening beneath a sky both cold and vast, beautiful, but never kind. A damp patch of ground might be where mammoths left their tracks. But it might also be where a person could easily slip and fall. A low meadow might look peaceful, yet still be enough to hide a predator closing in. A carcass left behind might be a source of life, but also a summons calling other jaws toward it. In Pleistocene ecosystems like those described by the NPS, the climate was cooler and wetter than in many of those same places today, and the presence of megafauna did not merely create magnificent scenes, but shaped danger, rhythm, and even the mental map of the small human groups moving through them. There is a very different kind of loneliness when human beings walk through such a world. Not the loneliness of having no life around you, but the loneliness of there being too much life around you, and too much of it far larger than yourself. You are not the main character of the landscape. You are not the master of the continent. You are only a small creature with fire, memory, and a few stone tools, trying to read the footprints in the mud to know what passed before you and how long ago. Perhaps that is why the fossilized footprints at White Sands move us so deeply. They do not merely show that ancient humans were there. They show that those people walked among animals that today we know only through bone and reconstruction. A human step beside a mammoth track, a sloth track, or the crossings of many species on damp ground is an image both humble and majestic. Human beings were not standing outside nature. They were walking within it. That world changed in time. Most of those giant creatures did not continue into the present. Giant ground sloths vanished. Mammoths vanished from this continent. And saber-toothed cats remain only in fossil bone and imagination. Sources from the AMNH, the Smithsonian, and the NPS all describe them as prominent parts of North America's megafauna until the end of the Ice Age, after which they declined and disappeared near the close of the Pleistocene, in a story whose causes are still debated among climate change, hunting pressure, and other factors. But in this chapter, we do not yet need to enter the ending. We need only pause in the moment when they were still alive, still crossing mud, still breathing in the cold wind. And human beings still had to lift their heads to look at them with a mixture of astonishment and caution. Because that, perhaps, is the true heart of this chapter, not a list of species, not measurements or dates, but the feeling of a continent that had not yet shrunk itself to fit the human eye. A continent where the shadow of a mammoth could fall long like a moving cliff, where a saber-toothed cat could turn the meadow ahead into utter stillness, where a giant ground sloth could appear as one of those strange forms nature once attempted and never kept. And among all those immense presences, the first people of the Americas still walked, still built fires, still searched for their way, still guided children across muddy banks, still listened through the night to know what life was moving around them. It is in that contrast that they become clearest, not because they were greater than the world, but because they dared to live within a world so immense. So tonight, when you close your eyes, perhaps hold on to this image for a long while. An ancient lakeshore beneath a gray, cold sky, the muddy bank still soft, wind moving through low reeds, and in the distance, the bodies of mammoths like moving hills, while at the edge of light and shadow stands the still silhouette of a long-fanged cat, and a little nearer, a giant ground sloth slowly turning as though time had never been anything to hurry. And somewhere smaller than all those things, only a group of human beings standing still, watching, waiting, remembering. For in the world of North America's Ice Age beasts, survival did not begin with fighting. Survival began with knowing who you were standing among. Let the grasslands filled with footprints from the previous chapter drift a little farther into the distance. Let the mammoth herd, those fur-covered bodies moving through the cold wind, slowly dissolve into the gray horizon. And then, as everything opens wider, we begin to realize that the story of the first people in the Americas did not truly begin in the Americas. It began in a place in between, a place not entirely Asia, not yet entirely America, a place that today lies mostly beneath the sea, but in the Ice Age was once a real land, vast, dry, cold, and windswept, with grass bending under the wind the way fur bends under a passing gust. That place was Beringia, not merely a narrow land bridge for people to cross and forget, but an entire world that once existed, a world with lakes, grasses, herds of large animals, and perhaps small groups of human beings who lived there far longer than our simplified imagination tends to allow. Beringia was formed when sea levels fell during the Ice Age, exposing a broad landmass connecting Siberia and Alaska at its greatest extent. That connection may have stretched nearly 1,000 miles from north to south, far greater than the image of a fragile bridge people so often imagine. If you enter Beringia through imagination, the first thing you should leave behind is the image of a short, cold, empty passage. Beringia was not simply the strip that joined two bodies of land. It was a land large enough to have its own weather, its own light, its own seasons, and its own loneliness. The sky there must have felt enormous, the air clearer, drier. The ground was not covered in dense forest, but opened into a distinctive steppe tundra, where grasses, herbs, and low vegetation stretched beneath a wind-filled sky. NPS materials describe how the lowered sea level made Beringia far broader and gave it a more continental climate, with low precipitation, open skies, and conditions that created a distinctive ecological community, rich enough to sustain an entire world of megafauna. Let us imagine a morning there. No border stood erected against the horizon. No marker said that one side was Asia and the other America. There was only cold wind moving across the earth, long clouds, and ribbons of grass quietly leaning in one direction, farther away. The land rolled low and then opened again, not like a road, but like a place meant for life. A herd of reindeer passed in their silent order. Farther still were bison, ancient horses, perhaps even mammoths, creatures that Beringia once supported as a land wide enough for them to move, stop, feed, and breed according to the rhythm of the seasons. NPS describes Beringia as a place where caribou, lions, musk oxen, mammoths, bears, and many other species once coexisted. Those great animal populations were not merely passing across a land bridge, but were truly living within that landscape. And somewhere in that windswept land, there may have been human beings, not a band of people hurrying through to quickly reach a new world, not the overly tidy image of a straight-line journey from one continent to the next, but small groups living by the seasons, knowing where water lay, where the herds passed through, where the wind cut harder in the cold months, where a temporary shelter could be raised, a fire lit, hides dried, a stone edge sharpened again. The beauty of Beringia lies in the way it forces us to slow down before familiar words, like migration or crossing. For a land vast enough to sustain both mammoths and bison, wide enough to create its own climate, was also a land vast enough not only to be crossed, but to be inhabited, waded in, adapted to, and gradually become part of over many generations. Ancient DNA research now suggests that the ancestors of most indigenous peoples of the Americas were connected to an ancestral population formed in Northeast Asia and Beringia, and genome data from Alaska points to a deep period of branching during or near the time when Beringia still existed as its own separate frozen world. Look at a night in Beringia, not the night of a forest, where darkness is held between tree trunks. This is the night of open land, where darkness lies close to the ground and the wind can travel far without striking anything but grass and the large sleeping bodies standing somewhere out there. A small fire in such a night must have been both precious and fragile. Precious because it was warmth, light, the temporary center of memory and food. Fragile because around it stretched an entire land that had not reduced itself to the scale of human beings. If people sat beside that fire, they were surely used to hearing the footfalls of animals before seeing them, used to the wind carrying the smell of water, fur, and snow, used to a day that might begin beneath a clear sky and end in a cold sharp enough to lash against the skin. NPS describes Beringia as an environment where cold, dry, open conditions and the presence of large animals shaped the survival rhythms of prehistoric humans in the region. In a place like that, the ground became memory. You remembered where the herds returned. You remembered which rise in the land blocked some of the wind. You remembered where the ice froze more thinly along the edge of the water. You remembered which places held slightly thicker grass in summer. You remembered where the good stone for tools could be found. And more important than all of that, you remembered that the world did not stand still. The Beringia of 1 year was not exactly the Beringia of generations before. For the existence of that land depended on something greater than any human group, the amount of water locked away in the continental ice sheets. When the ice thickened, the sea withdrew, and land appeared. When the ice slowly melted, the sea returned, patiently, irresistibly, swallowing piece by piece that cold grassland until only the fragments we now see in Alaska and Siberia remained. Both USGS and NPS emphasize that the land that once joined the two continents was gradually submerged as sea level rose after the glacial maximum. There is something profoundly sad in that thought. A world wide enough for great animals, for lakes, for wind, for human memory, was at last closed over by the sea above it, not destroyed by some sudden catastrophe, but erased more slowly, more quietly, like an old room gradually filling with water that no one can save. What was once grassland now lies beneath shallow seas. Places that may once have been lake shores, hunting grounds, stopping places, or summer paths survive only as hints preserved in sediment, mud cores, seafloor topography, and the careful hypotheses of modern science. Recent USGS studies on the Bering Shelf show that beneath today's marine sediments, there are still traces of ancient lake basins that existed when that region was dry land during the Ice Age. And because most of Beringia has sunk beneath the sea, it has become more like a continent of memory than a place easily imagined. We cannot stand upon most of that vanished ground today and watch the wind sweep across it. We cannot point to a valley and say, "Here, perhaps someone once lit a fire." We cannot walk along a stretch of grass and say, "The herd curved around here." All that remains are the edges of a lost world. Fossils, sediment samples, archaeological traces at the margins of that former land, and genetic clues carried in the bodies of people alive today. Ancient DNA is one of the strangest things at this point. It feels like an echo that comes not from stone or animal bone, but from the bloodline of descendants themselves, revealing a time of branching, isolation, and formation among ancestral populations linked to Beringia. If we think of it that way, Beringia was not only land, it was time, a waiting ground, a place of temporary refuge, a region where human history seemed to hold its breath for many generations before moving strongly again. Some recent scientific overviews describe the earliest stage of the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas as a process of entering Beringia from Northeast Asia, then passing through a period of isolation lasting several millennia before the population branches spread more widely. Seen this way, Beringia is no longer merely a bridge in the simple geographic sense, but a distinct chapter of human history, where people were shaped not only by the act of crossing space, but by the space itself. So when we speak of Beringia, the thing most worth remembering is not the map, not the line joining two continental masses in a textbook, but the feeling that a world once lay there, in the middle of what is sea today, and that human beings had to live by its rules. The wind there did not ask where you had come from. The cold season there did not care which direction you meant to go. The herds there did not know they were walking between two continents. Everything simply existed, and any human group that hoped to survive had to read the ground, the sky, the animals, and the season. A place like that did not create noisy heroes. It created endurance. It created long memory. It created people accustomed to standing within immensity without losing their way. Perhaps on some distant afternoon, a child once ran across a ridge of land in Beringia, where the wind blew so hard that almost all of the laughter was carried away. Perhaps an adult bent down to pick up a suitable piece of stone, then tucked it away for the evening. Perhaps someone looked toward the horizon without ever imagining that they stood between two worlds. To them, this was not the place that joined Asia and America. It was simply home, even if that home was made of cold grass, drifting dust, and the pale light of the Ice Age. And perhaps that thought brings us closer to them. For the places most important in history rarely know, while they still exist, that one day they will be called turning points for the whole human story. They are simply places where people live, wait, endure, and keep walking when the season allows. Then the sea rose, not quickly like a storm, but so slowly that perhaps many generations never realized they were gradually losing an entire world. The old shoreline retreated. The lower places flooded first. Summer paths were no longer the same. Inland lakes turned brackish, then vanished beneath the sea. The grasslands where great animals once walked were cut apart from one another. A land once wide as a world slowly closed in upon itself beneath the returning water. And then, at some point, Beringia was no longer a living continent. It became geological memory, a submerged outline, a name modern people use for a land no longer visible to the eye. But even though that land is gone, its influence remains. It remains in the fossils of great animals, in the sediments lying beneath the seabed, in the climate and vegetation models science is still trying to reconstruct, and it remains in the far larger story, that between two continents there once lay a world broad enough to carry within itself an early part of the history of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Not an empty corridor, not a hyphen, but a land with weather, with living creatures, with rhythms of life, and perhaps even with small fires flickering in the wind. So, if tonight you wish to keep one image from this chapter before moving on, keep the image of a vast, cold grassland lying where the sea is now, a high sky, wind traveling without end, mammoths appearing as dark shapes in the distance, and a small group of people pausing beside a strip of shallow water. Bending down to light a fire on land they did not call a border. They did not know that tens of thousands of years later, people would look down at a map and call this place Beringia. They only knew that this was the ground beneath their feet, the wind they had to endure, the season they had to pass through. And sometimes, in history, it is places that were once simply home that go on to change the fate of continents yet to come. Imagine a very early morning, still cold, though no longer as cold as Beringia. The wind still carries the breath of ice, but on the earth, something has already changed. Before the eye stretches no longer merely a gray expanse of grass running between two continents. Now the world begins to open into many worlds, larger rivers, deeper valleys, coastlines reaching down toward the south, grasslands so wide they seem to have no end, and somewhere within that vast opening, small groups of people begin to move in many different directions, like water spilling out from a lake basin, slow here, swift there, yet in the end still finding its way across an entire continent. NPS overviews describe that after the barriers of ice began to allow humans to move farther into North America, within only a few hundred years, after about 12,000 BCE, Paleo-Indian groups appear to have been present across most of the North American continent. But if we call this a spread, we must also remember that it did not resemble a procession of people all traveling along a single road. It was more like many heartbeats separating from one greater heartbeat. Some groups moved quickly along corridors rich in water and game. Some lingered longer in lands that promised enough food to survive the season. Some followed belts of landscape where moving on seemed more natural than turning back. And gradually, what had once been an early ancestral population became many different communities, reading different kinds of ground, remembering different skies, and beginning to carry different futures in their own footsteps. Ancient DNA from Central and South America shows that this process was both rapid and complex. One ancestral branch spread out very early, and later there were population shifts and north-south connections that could never have been seen through stone artifacts alone. Perhaps the most astonishing thing is not that humans eventually came to exist throughout the Americas. The astonishing thing is the speed with which that seems to have happened. If one initial ancestral group moved southward from the frozen world of the north, then only a few millennia later, traces of human beings were appearing in landscapes very far from one another. From North America all the way to South America. A synthesis based on radiocarbon dates in South America suggests that the earliest reliable archaeological evidence there appears around 15,100 to 14,000 years ago. and that the threshold of first presence may lie between about 16,600 and 15,100 years ago. That makes the human spread southward look less like a slow crawl across a map, and more like a very rapid expansion of presence across landscapes and climates that were continually changing. Let us look at it as a scene from a film rather than a diagram. A group of people stand on the bank of a great river, its water cold and clouded with silt. They do not know that they are discovering a continent. They know only that there is water in front of them, the road already traveled behind them, and that somewhere along this riverbank there may be a better place to raise a shelter, light a fire, butcher meat, dry hides, and keep small children alive for a few more nights. Another group, very far from there, may be watching the horizon open into dry grass and wind, yet another may already be growing used to the salt smell of sea air, to fish, water birds, seaweed, shellfish, and rhythms of life no longer like those of the great game hunting lands of the north. The spread of the first people in the Americas, then, was not only movement through space, it was a chain of small moments in which human beings decided to stay one more season, or travel on for one more season. And each of those choices pushed history a little farther forward. Perhaps in those earliest years, they still lived close to the memory of the frozen world. Spears, stone points, the skills of watching herds, the habits of reading wind and ground, all of these still remained useful. But the new continent did not require human beings to remain the same forever. It compelled them to change. This becomes quite visible in the later phases of the Paleo-Indian period. NPS notes that in the southeastern part of North America, after the Clovis period and the first fluted tools, many groups began to adapt to optimal resource zones rather than moving at random. And later their survival strategies gradually shifted from hunting megafauna toward hunting smaller animals and broad-spectrum gathering as southern pine forests replaced earlier cold-adapted woodlands. It was not a dramatic rupture. It was more like a bending of the body in response to the continent. Imagine it more intimately. A child born in the north may grow up in a world where low grass, strong wind, and great herds stand at the center of all attention. But that child's own son or daughter, if the family has traveled much farther south or east, may learn an entirely different set of memories. They learn the sound of river water instead of the sound of open wind. They learn the smell of damp forest instead of cold grassland. They learn the tracks of deer, the hoofprints of smaller animals, the marks of water birds, instead of being familiar only with the deep round prints of mammoth or bison. And by the time we reach the grandchildren of that child, life may have changed again. This is how a continent makes many different kinds of people out of one original line, not by decree, but through countless mornings with different food, different terrain, and different things that must be remembered in order to live. And when we look much farther south, the picture grows broader still. Ancient DNA studies published in 2018 showed that the earliest ancient individuals from Chile, Brazil, and Belize once carried a type of ancestry connected to the Anzic individual associated with Clovis in Montana, suggesting that the expansion of Clovis-related communities did not affect only North America, but reached down into Central and South America as well. Yet the strange thing is that this ancestry no longer dominates among later individuals in South America. showing that a large-scale population change began at least by around 9,000 years ago. In other words, the first spread did not create a flat and singular history. It opened the way for later cycles of movement, replacement, and mixture. If one only looked at the surface, one might imagine people moving south like an arrow shot in a straight line. But real life never moves like an arrow. It moves the way fire moves through dry grass, catching quickly here, slowly there, blocked by damp earth in one place, then flaring again where the wind favors it. In some regions, the first traces of human presence are very thin, almost like a faint tapping at the door of time. Radiocarbon research in South America shows that the earliest phase, from about 15,100 to 13,500 years ago, has a very sparse archaeological signal, and only afterward does the intensity of the evidence begin to rise more quickly around 13,200 to 12,700 years ago. That suggests something profoundly human for a time. Those first groups must still have been few, their fires far apart, their footsteps still easy for the earth to swallow without leaving much for the future. Then gradually, as populations grew, as routes became familiar, as places began to be revisited again and again, the new continent truly began to carry a dense human presence. Perhaps along one coastline, someone learned to read the tides the way their ancestors had once read the movement of herds on a wide grassland. Someone still kept the habit of looking for miles ahead to catch the faint movement of prey in the foothills. People learned something else, which path could be crossed, which would send loose stones sliding, which ravine still held water even when the dry season deepened. The spread across the Americas was not simply a map gradually filling with archaeological dots. It was a storehouse of survival memory growing ever thicker within the human mind. Each new land was not merely reached, it had to be learned. It had to be lived in long enough to distinguish what could be trusted from what would betray you. It had to be named in memory, even if we can no longer hear those names today, and for that reason. This chapter may be felt more as the movement of many families than as a migration in the abstract sense. Imagine a mother tightening an animal hide around her child's shoulders as the wind turns cold. A young man glancing back at the footprints of the entire group in soft mud to make sure no one has fallen behind. An older person crouching by the water's edge, testing it with a hand to know whether it is shallow or deep. Another child lifting up a shell, a stone, or a branch never seen in the old place, gazing at it with a curiosity both tiny and ancient. A continent is not spread into merely through great hunts, but through countless small acts like these. None of them knows they are becoming the first people here. They are only searching for a place where tomorrow may still be lived. In South America, the story becomes even more extraordinary when we think of the distances involved. Some recent studies still regard Monte Verde II in Chile as a major landmark, with an occupation layer dated to around 14,550 years ago. And for a long time it has stood as a symbol of the possibility that humans were present very early in the far south of the continent. Yet by March 2026, a new study in science had strongly challenged that date and reignited the debate. In other words, one of the most famous sites in the story of the southward spread is still being reconsidered. But even though the argument around Monte Verde remains unresolved, The larger picture from many sites and from genetics still shows that human beings had moved deep into South America very early on the prehistoric timescale. But perhaps what makes this journey most memorable is not how fast it was. It is the way each land pulled human beings into its own form. The southeast, denser and warmer, eventually led to hunting and gathering strategies different from those of the megafauna grasslands. Changes in stone point styles across many regions reflect not only the passage of time, but the fact that human beings stayed long enough in a place to reshape both their tools and their rhythms of life to fit local resources. NPS describes the Middle and Late Paleo-Indian period in the southeast as a time when inhabitants increasingly focused on favorable resource zones and shifted toward hunting smaller modern animals, along with broader subsistence strategies. In other words, the continent was not only filled by people, people were shaped back by the continent as well. If so, then spread is not a route. It is a process of becoming many different kinds of people while still carrying the distant memory of a common ancestor. One group continues to move across great open lands. Another begins to bind itself more closely to forests, to rivers, to seasons of fish or seed. Another still, in the far south, looks upon skies, mountain ranges, and winds unknown to its northern ancestors. Ancient DNA reveals unexpected connections between north and south, followed later by major population changes. Archaeology, meanwhile, shows that tools, shelters, food, and rhythms of life also changed with the environment. These two streams of evidence meet in one beautiful idea. The Americas were not inhabited by an endlessly repeated copy of the same first people. They gradually became the home of many new communities, different, profound, and increasingly possessed of histories of their own. And so, when we ask how the first Native Americans spread across the Americas, perhaps the most beautiful answer does not lie in the technical sense of the word how. It lies in this feeling: they moved on real human feet, with children beside them, with fire that had to be preserved, with tools that had to be sharpened again, with elders who could not be left behind, with harsh seasons that waited for no one. They did not expand like an army, but like life itself, finding its way through a continent too large to comprehend at once. They stayed where it was possible to stay. They moved on when moving on became necessary. They changed themselves according to river, forest, grass, mountain, and sea. And after enough generations, what had once been a very early set of footsteps in the north became countless fires across the Americas. There are questions in history that do not open like a door, but like two faint roads appearing at once in the mist. Each road seems plausible from a distance. Each carries its own kind of silence. And the question of the first route by which human beings entered the Americas is perhaps one such question. If we were standing in the cold night of the late Ice Age, turning southward from Beringia, no signpost would appear before us. There would be only two dim possibilities in the wind. One would be the long, winding, frigid rim of the coast, full of islands, full of bays, full of drifting ice, yet opening like a silver thread running down the Pacific. The other would be the widening gap slowly forming between two colossal walls of inland ice, like a crack in the body of the world itself, dark, narrow, and full of uncertainty. for many generations of scholarship. People have tried to peer through that mist to understand which path the first people took. And even now, the answer is not fully closed. If this story were told in the old way, it would be very straightforward. People came from Asia across Beringia, then waited for the ice to retreat from the interior of North America. And after that, followed an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets down toward the south. For many decades. That was the familiar image. A land route. Neat, clear on the map. Almost perfectly matched to our imagination of an entry into the continent. But science rarely allows tidy stories to endure forever without being tested. The more seriously pre-Clovis sites have been examined, the more that story has begun to tremble in places once thought secure. Recent studies and reviews have emphasized that human beings were already present south of the ice sheets by around 16,000 years ago or earlier. While the inland route remained blocked by ice for a long span, from roughly 26,000 to 14,000 years ago, that fact alone makes the ice-free corridor far harder to regard as the first doorway for the earliest human presence. But instead of thinking of this as a dry refutation, try imagining it through landscape. Before you lies the interior of North America at a very early moment, not wide grasslands, not gentle rivers, but masses of ice so immense that they almost erase the very idea of a route. Those two ice sheets do not merely sit in place. They breathe with the climate, shrinking and opening, leaving behind glacial lakes, barren ground, places only newly released from ice, yet still so impoverished that they could scarcely sustain a group of people on foot in an NPS presentation on the peopling of the Americas. James Dixon describes the northwestern coast as no longer being fully sealed by ice by around 16,000 years ago, while the interior corridor was certainly not open, and even between roughly 15,000 and 14,000 years ago remained very narrow, biologically poor, marked by glacial lakes and very little evidence of significant food resources. Only later, around 13,000 to 12,500 years ago, did it begin to become truly usable and livable. And so, when researchers began to look again toward the Pacific coast, they were not merely looking at a shoreline, they were looking at an entirely different world. Not a coast sealed by ice from end to end, but a complex margin with stretches free of ice, islands, ecological refuges, summer waters that could be traveled, and resource-rich edges of sea and land. In the NPS material itself, the northwestern coast at around 16,000 years ago is described as being ice-free along a long stretch, and Dixon even called it a kelp highway, a relatively continuous ecological belt from Northeast Asia down the west coast of North America, where fish, seabirds, seals, marine animals, and coastal resources could create not merely a pathway, but a living corridor. In that light, the coastal route no longer looks like a romantic hypothesis of distant little boats fading into the mist, but like a real possibility with breath in it, with food in it, with seasonal rhythms and its own logic of survival. Try standing on that coast itself in imagination. The sky is low and gray, the water is dark, far offshore. Sheets of winter ice may join the spaces between island and island, between one refuge and the next. The wind tastes more of salt than of grassland. Along the water's edge lie seaweed, shellfish, fish, the cast-up remains of marine animals, birds flying low over the surf. A human group would not necessarily have had to travel by boat for the entire journey the way films so often show it. At times, they may have walked on exposed ground where the ice had withdrawn. At times, they may have moved along the shore itself. At times, winter and sea ice may have turned stretches difficult to cross by water into temporary bridges of cold. A 2023 PNAS study, summarized by the USGS, even suggested that the most favorable windows for coastal travel may have depended not only on open summer water, but also on winter sea ice, helping to connect islands and coastal refugia. The authors identified two notable favorable windows, around 24,500 to 22,000 years ago, and 16,400 to 14,800 years ago. That changes the entire scene. The first people did not necessarily have to be simple walkers following a strip of dry land. They may have been people who knew how to live at the edge of the sea, who knew how to wait for the season, how to use ice when ice made movement possible, how to take to the water when water opened, and how to understand that a coastline was not an obstacle but a chain of opportunities if one was familiar enough with it. When the University of Oregon introduced this PNAS research, it even suggested that instead of thinking of the Kelp Highway only as a summer travel route, the story now seems more interesting. Early groups may have had to adapt at once to the world of summer kelp forests and winter sea ice. In other words, if the coastal route was real, it was not an easy road. It was the road of people who were highly flexible, deeply resilient, and accustomed to living in a world constantly shifting between water, ice, and stone. And what then of the ice-free corridor? Perhaps the fairest thing is not to turn it into the wrong road, but into the later one. A 2022 PNAS paper states quite plainly that new surface exposure ages show the final full opening of the ice-free corridor occurred later than the presence of pre-Clovis people, and therefore it could not have been the first route for the earliest peopling after the last glacial maximum. Yet, even within that summary, there is caution. The remaining uncertainties do not exclude the possibility that the corridor later became important for subsequent movements, especially as Clovis and later traditions spread. There is something beautiful in that, in its own way, because it allows both roads to remain alive within the story. Though not with the same role, the coastal route may have been the first whisper. The inland corridor may have become the broader doorway later, when the continent had grown less severe beneath human feet, and then archaeology began to place its own small fires into that debate in Idaho. The site of Cooper's Ferry shows evidence of initial occupation around 16,560 to 15,280 years ago. And the 2019 science paper states clearly that this predates the opening of the ice-free corridor, thereby supporting an entry into the Americas via the Pacific coast, in Oregon. Paisley Caves yielded human coprolites reconfirmed through biomarkers and DNA, with evidence showing that people had camped there by around 14,200 years ago. Such sites do not directly show us which boat was used, which landing beach was chosen, or which shelter lay along the coast. But they resemble fires that had already burned far enough south at a time when the inland route was still too narrow, too impoverished, or simply too late to be the strongest candidate for the earliest human presence. But pause over that feeling for a moment. Rather than holding only the dates in mind, imagine a group of people moving southward with the cold sea on their right, ice on their left, and between those two things a narrow but real corridor of life. They do not know they are acting out a future academic debate. They know only that ahead lies another bay to pass, another band of rock to avoid, another shelter from the wind to find before darkness falls. They know that where there are tides, there is the rhythm of food. They know that where there is winter ice. The distance between islands can at times become shorter in a way only those who are hungry and moving can truly understand. And when summer opens the water, that same sea route becomes the way forward again. What modern research reconstructs through models of currents, sea ice, paleoceanography, and refugia may have appeared in their lived experience only as very simple knowledge. This place can be crossed. That one cannot yet. This month we can still move. Next month we must stop. This year the ice joins more closely than last. Here there are seals. There is fresh water. There is also a quiet sadness in the debate over the coastal route. It is the sadness that much of the direct evidence for this path may now lie underwater. After the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose quickly, swallowing most of the ancient coastline where the earliest people may once have camped, butchered food, repaired tools, or tended fires. That gives the coastal route a small injustice within the archaeological record. It may once have been immensely important. But the very success of time in drowning, it has made proof harder to recover. In its presentations, the NPS also emphasizes that late Pleistocene sea level rise inundated old shorelines and continental shelves, while the USGS sees coastal refugia and openings as key parts of early movement models along the Pacific coast. A road taken by the sea will always leave behind fewer footprints than one that still lies on dry land. That is why this chapter is not the place to say the mystery has been solved. It is the place to accept that history is sometimes reconstructed from unequal things. On one side is the inland corridor, very clear on the map, but seemingly opening too late to be the first route for pre-Clovis people. On the other is the coast, full of promise, supported by many climate models, oceanographic reconstructions, and some indirect archaeological evidence. Yet the ancient shore itself has sunk too deeply beneath the sea. In 2018, science described the feeling exactly. The arrival routes of the first Americans remain uncertain, not because there is no data, but because the data comes from many directions, in many forms, and compels us to live with the degree of uncertainty proper to science. And perhaps that is the true beauty of this chapter. Not the beauty of a neat answer, but the beauty of seeing two roads in the mist, and then understanding that the first people in the Americas may not have chosen the route that seems most intelligible to us today. They may have chosen the path visible only to those who could see ice as bridge, the coast as pantry, and a chain of cold islands and bays as a negotiable way forward. They may have arrived not through one grand inland crossing, but through many small stages, many waiting seasons, many bends along the coast, many moments of moving on and stopping again. And it is also possible that many generations later, when the inland ice had retreated far enough and the ice-free corridor had become a livable route, others followed that way instead, carrying with them different techniques, different traditions, and different futures. So if tonight you wish to hold on to one image, let it be the image of two roads appearing together in the gray light of the Ice Age. One road is the dark coast, where water, ice, and stone take turns opening the way for people accustomed to the instability of the ocean's edge. The other is the gap between two walls of ice, narrow, cold, barren, and only gradually becoming livable as time moved on. Perhaps the first route into the Americas was never carved into the map as a single arrow, but it is precisely in that uncertainty that we see more clearly what matters most. The first people did not enter a continent through myth. They entered it through patience, through an ability to read the landscape more deeply than fear, and through a memory of survival deep enough to recognize a pathway in places that, to those who came later, would have seemed nothing but ice, sea, and silence. Ancient DNA and the Pre-Clovis mystery. Who came before Clovis? There was a time when this story was told as though it had a very clear beginning. A distinctive stone point lying in cold earth, a late Ice Age landscape, a culture spread across many regions of North America, and the name Clovis standing there like a first marker, powerful and almost impossible to replace. For a long time, many people grew used to thinking of the earliest chapter of the Americas in precisely that way. Before Clovis, there was darkness. Then Clovis appeared like a first fire, bright enough to make people believe that before it, there was almost nothing else of consequence to be seen. But history rarely remains still within a shape that is too neat. At first, change came very softly, not through a single discovery strong enough to wipe away everything that came before, but through small scattered signals, sometimes so fragile that they made people hesitate. A site in a cave, an ancient layer of sediment, a surviving biological sample, a few stone tools unlike what anyone expected, and then, little by little, beneath the white light of the laboratory, another door began to open. It was no longer only stone, earth, and the shape of tools. Now the past began to speak through something far more discreet, far deeper, and stranger still, ancient DNA. If archaeology once grew accustomed to listening to history through chipped stone, buried layers of earth, and footprints impressed into mud, it now began to hear history through fragments of information lying deep within the bodies of ancient people themselves. Not voices, not writing, not legend, but fragile biological sequences, preserved across spans of time so long they are almost difficult to believe. From that, the picture began to widen, and once it widened, Clovis no longer stood alone at the point of beginning. Perhaps one of the places where that story changed most clearly was Anzic, Montana. Not a great grassland, not a hunting scene in the cold wind, but a very quiet place, where the remains of a small child were found together with an extraordinary assemblage of artifacts, stone tools, bone tools, the red color of ancient pigment, all lying there like a moment held very deep within the earth. Many years later, when the child's genome was studied, what emerged was not merely an ancient individual. What emerged was a very deep connection to indigenous communities of the Americas. That child does not stand outside indigenous history. The child lies within it. very close to the ancestral lines that would continue traveling far into the future. But the quieter thing, and perhaps the more memorable one, is that this genome showed that by the time Clovis appeared clearly on the surface of the Earth, the ancestral story was no longer simple. The major branches had apparently already diverged. That means that even while Clovis emerged as a striking technological tradition, beneath that clear visibility there were already deeper layers of human history, so deep that Clovis could no longer be the absolute first point people had once believed it to be. And then the story draws us north again, to Alaska, to a place colder and quieter still, at Upward Sun River. Researchers found the remains of 2 infants from the end of the Ice Age. One of the genomes recovered there would later become an extraordinarily important discovery. It showed that there was an ancient human branch in Alaska that split off very early from the other ancestral branches of indigenous peoples of the Americas. That branch came to be called the ancient Beringians. That fact alone is enough to make the past look entirely different. Because instead of a single line of people moving straight ahead without branching, history now resembles a great tree whose many limbs had already begun to spread very early, during or just after the time when Beringia was still a world of wind, grass, and ice. Once you begin to think about it that way, Clovis suddenly changes meaning. It does not disappear. It does not lose its importance. It remains one of the clearest, most beautiful, most recognizable chapters of early North America. But Clovis is no longer the only doorway. It becomes part of the story. Rather than the whole beginning of the story, it is like a great fire, bright enough for those who came later to see it clearly. But now we know that before that fire, in a wider darkness, there were other lights that had been quietly burning. And the farther south one goes, the more ancient DNA complicates the picture. Studies on ancient individuals from Central and South America reveal something both strange and beautiful. Some very ancient genomes from the far south carry deep connections to the ancestral branch associated with Anzic in North America. That suggests that a human line tied to Clovis, or very near to Clovis, once spread far to the south, but then, over time, those connections no longer remain as visible among many later communities. It seems that ancient waves of people did not always stay fixed in one land after arriving there. Some branches continued onward and left deep, lasting descendants. Some faded in the genetic record. Some may have been absorbed into other communities. And some, perhaps, remain only as a faint echo in the data. And so, the more we know, the harder it becomes to return to a simple story. If we had only stone tools, we might still be tempted by clean lines, one type of point, one technological tradition, one expanding map. But ancient DNA does not tell the story that way. It does not like straight lines. It speaks in nearness and distance, in shared ancestry, in branching, in deep connections invisible to the naked eye. It makes the history of the earliest Americas look less like a single journey and more like many currents flowing together through an ancient darkness. And it is here that the pre-Clovis mystery steps forward more clearly than ever, because archaeology now has sites that make it impossible to keep saying that before Clovis there was only emptiness. In Paisley Caves in Oregon, ancient biological samples and other evidence show that human beings were present there before the Clovis period, at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho. Early occupation evidence also pushes human presence back beyond the limit the old Clovis first model once allowed. These places are not loud. They do not have the grandeur of monuments. But for that very reason, they feel trustworthy in a very particular way. They are like small knocks on an old door, knocking and knocking, steadily, until whoever is inside is forced to admit that someone had already been standing outside long before. And yet, the hardest question is no longer, were there people before Clovis? More and more evidence pushes the answer toward yes. The harder question by far is this: who were those people? Did they belong to the same ancestral line that would later become the indigenous communities of the Americas? Were they one coherent group, or many different groups, arriving at different times, by different routes? Do all pre-Clovis sites tell the same story? Or are they only standing side by side beneath the same conceptual umbrella that science has temporarily raised while still not seeing the full picture? And that is exactly where the mystery becomes deepest. There may once have been groups of people who arrived very early, leaving only faint traces that no longer stand out clearly in the ancestral tree visible to us today. Or perhaps they do remain within that tree, only we have not yet found a piece of data direct enough to connect them to the later branches. There may have been more waves of arrival than we imagine. There may have been communities that did not carry Clovis-style fluted technology, did not live as Clovis people did, yet still belonged to that deeper layer of history from which later major traditions would emerge. That is why pre-Clovis should perhaps not be imagined as too sharply defined a proper name. It is more like the blurred region of dawn in that not yet risen light. There are human shadows that have passed through, leaving a few traces, a few tools, a few biological samples, a few thin occupation layers, but not yet appearing clearly enough for us to say with certainty who they were within the full ancestral tree of indigenous America. If Clovis is the part of the past we can hold rather firmly in our hands, then pre-Clovis is the part of the past whose sleeve we have only just managed to touch. And then ancient DNA enters like a new kind of light, not strong enough to erase every darkness, but enough to show that the darkness has depth. It shows that before Clovis there was not a void. Before Clovis, there were people, there was branching, there were histories already underway far earlier than anyone once imagined. There were movements and separations taking place long before fluted points became a defining sign across the continent. Perhaps the most beautiful thing here is that science does not try to make the mystery artificially smaller. It does not hurry to replace one simple story with another simple story. It only quietly shows that the opening chapter of the Americas is broader than we thought, older than we thought, richer in layers of people than we thought. When we look at ancient genomes, at pre-Clovis sites, at early diverging ancestral branches in Alaska, at unexpected connections stretching all the way down into Central and South America, we no longer see a doorway with one first person stepping through it. We see a land growing larger beneath the feet of many generations. So, if tonight you want to keep one image from this chapter, keep a very still one. A laboratory table. Upon it are very small things, a fragment of an artifact, a sample of soil, an ancient biological trace, a strand of DNA read out from the silence of time. No single object is large enough, on its own, to tell the story of an entire continent, but placed beside one another. They make the past change meaning. They make Clovis stop standing alone at the point of beginning. And among these very small things, one question remains alive, light yet deep as the sound of wind passing through an old land. Before Clovis, who was here? Perhaps we still do not have a complete answer, but now we know one thing for certain. Before the name Clovis appeared clearly upon the cold grasslands of history, the human story in the Americas had already begun to stir, earlier, deeper, and more quietly than anyone had once dared to believe. And now, after we have passed the ancient lake shores of white sands, the low firelight of the Clovis hunters, the great shadowed world of mammoths and giant sloths, the lost land called Beringia, the debated pathways between coast and ice, and even the deeper mysteries opened by ancient DNA. Perhaps it is time to pause over something truly important, that this story does not end in the past. It does not end beneath dried mud. It does not end in stone points lying motionless under cold ground. It does not end in ancient genomes deciphered beneath the white light of the laboratory. And it certainly does not end in that desolate feeling ancient history so often leaves with the listener, as though those first human beings were only shadows fading into the deep night and vanishing from the world. No. What this final chapter wishes to preserve, quietly and carefully, is the opposite. Those first human beings did not disappear in the way later generations have sometimes imagined. They are not merely subjects of archaeology. They are not only distant ancestors locked away in dates, sediments, and academic reports. Their footprints, their earliest steps, their journeys through cold wind and hard seasons did not ultimately lead into oblivion. They lead to living people. They lead to communities still here. They lead to voices still telling. They lead to memories that do not lie only in the ground, but in families, in ceremony, in language, in the naming of rivers and mountains, in stories passed beside the fire through many generations. Perhaps that is the most beautiful thing we can carry with us as we leave the world of the Ice Age. For a very long time, stories about the first people have often been told as though they were the opening chapter of a book long since closed. The listener enters, sees fragments of bone, stone tools, desolate landscapes, and then leaves with the feeling of having passed through a dead realm. But for the history of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, that way of seeing has never truly been enough. Because between the earliest footprints and the present, there is not only the distance of time, there is also continuity. Not always simple, not always a straight line one can easily see, but real continuity nonetheless. Try to imagine another night, not the night of white sands, not the night of Beringia, but a night much closer to us. The wind still moves across that land, just as it did thousands of years ago. The dark still falls according to the earth's own rhythm. And somewhere, in an indigenous community, a story is still being told, perhaps not in the exact language of archaeology, not in terms such as late Pleistocene, migration routes, or ancestral populations, but in another rhythm of telling, a rhythm of living memory, of tradition, of people remembering where they belong, from what land they come, what responsibilities they bear toward that place and toward those who came before them. In that light, history suddenly becomes something else. It is no longer a room full of artifacts seen from the outside. It becomes a house that is still inhabited. And perhaps that is one of the most important things modern science, too, is learning again for a very long time. Many stories about the past of the Americas were told almost entirely in the voices of archaeologists, geologists, anthropologists, and geneticists. Those voices have brought many precious things. They have helped open lost worlds. They have helped us look again at immensities of time. They have helped confirm footprints, routes, and branchings invisible to the naked eye. But as time has gone on, people have increasingly understood that one thing is indispensable. Indigenous communities today do not stand outside that story. They are not merely heirs to a past interpreted for them by others. They are part of the story itself. So, when we speak of a living legacy, it does not mean only that DNA still runs in the blood, though that too is a profound part of the truth. It also means that the land still has names, the mountains still have meaning, the rivers are still remembered through stories that were not born in museums. There are communities that still carry traditions about the first times, about the making of the world, about journeys, about great animals, about the lands that sustained their ancestors. Of course, those traditions do not always correspond point for point with modern archaeological models. They were not created to serve as footnotes to science, but they do something else, something deeply important. They keep the connection between human beings and the past from becoming something wholly alien. What does that mean, if we think of it more gently, more closely? It means that the first people left more than footprints on a muddy shore. They left a much longer kind of presence, a way of surviving in the cold wind, a way of seeing landscape not as mere resource, but as a place one must listen to, a way of passing on skill, memory, story, and above all, a feeling of belonging. Of course, after thousands of years, the Americas became the home of countless very different communities, with different languages, different ways of life, different cosmologies. One cannot and should not flatten all of that into a single image, but it is precisely within that diversity that the wonder becomes clearer. From those very early footsteps on a wide and cold continent, so many human worlds eventually came into being. Each community is its own way of continuing the story. There are communities deeply bound to open plains, communities tied to desert, canyon, and sun-red plateau, communities that grew with the northern forests, deep lakes, and the return of winter ice each year, communities living close to the sea, where tides and wind carry a rhythm of life entirely different from that of the first great game grasslands, communities that hold tightly to forms of ceremony, storytelling, weaving, music, home building, kinship terms, and ways of naming the earth and sky as something inseparable from who they are. Each community is a long chapter in history, not an appendix to the opening one. And that is what makes us slow down before the word ancestor. An ancestor is not only someone very distant, very dim, very ancient. An ancestor, in a deeper sense, is someone still walking beside the present, walking in language, in family memory, in the way a community tells of the place from which it comes, in the seasons of ceremony, in teachings that say one must remember land, remember water, remember animals, Remember the relationships human beings should never take for granted. When we think this way, the distance between White Sands and today is no longer merely 20-some thousand years. It becomes an invisible bridge of continuity. Though that bridge is never wholly smooth, never wholly unbroken, and has endured so many fractures through climate change, through time, and especially through the violent history of colonization that came later. And yes, perhaps we should not close this story by pretending that all of this continuity unfolded gently. Many indigenous communities in the Americas have endured profound losses in recent centuries. Lands were taken, languages were weakened, children were separated from family and tradition. Many ways of telling were diminished, pushed aside, or replaced by interpretations that did not come from the communities themselves. That is why, when we speak of a living legacy, we should not speak as though such a thing survives easily. It survives because it has been protected, because it has been retold, because there have been people who refuse to let ancestral memory be severed completely. And at this point, the final chapter is not only about the past, it is also about endurance. That endurance, if we look carefully, was already there from the beginning. It was there when an older person led a child across the mud of White Sands. It was there when a small group stood in the wind of Beringia and still knew how to make fire. It was there when human beings learned how to live beside the enormous bodies of the Ice Age world. It was there when the first communities moved deep into a continent so vast it could not be taken in at a glance. What survives into the present is not only lineage in the biological sense. What survives is also that quality, the ability to keep going through changes so great they seem impossible to survive. Perhaps that is what makes this story feel less distant than we first imagined. Because in the end, all human beings live by the memory of those who came before them. But here, that memory takes on a very particular beauty. It was not preserved in books from the beginning. It was not carved into stone to wait for the future. It passed through earth, through spoken telling, through communal life, through thousands of years of changing landscapes, and it is still here, not intact in the still, silent way of an object locked away for safekeeping, but alive in the way a flame is passed from hand to hand, stronger at times, weaker at times, but never wholly extinguished. And perhaps, if we wish, we can hear that even in the way indigenous communities today speak about the land itself. Many of us are accustomed to seeing land as something inert, a surface to walk across, a map to divide, a possession to own. But in many indigenous traditions, land does not remain still in that way. Land has relationships. It has memory. It comes with responsibility. Perhaps that is why modern archaeological debates, important as they are, have never been the whole story, because the question of who came first is only one part. Another part, deeper and more human, is this: how did people live with the land, and how are their descendants still living with it today? If we think of it that way, this final chapter is no longer merely an ending, it becomes a return to the present, but not a poorer present, once the dream of history has been closed away. On the contrary, a fuller one, because now, looking back across the journey we have taken, we know that the first people do not lie dead and motionless in the past. They continue walking in many present lives, in communities still struggling to keep their languages, in storytellers who still remember the names of rivers and mountains in the language of their ancestors, in families that still pass on to children the sense that they do not stand apart from the land, but belong to a very long chain of relationship. And suddenly, even the footprints at white sands begin to change. They are no longer only astonishing evidence for archaeologists. They become a softer, deeper symbol, a reminder that the beginning of this story did not disappear. It merely changed form. From a footprint in mud, it entered a community. From a step beside an ancient lake, it entered a world of language, ritual, memory, and identity. From a short journey made by one older figure and one child, it entered a span of time so long that the present still carries its echo. So, if tonight you wish to keep one final image before the story closes, keep this one. Not a desolate place, not an empty site, not a skeleton lying beneath glass, but a fire burning in the present. Around it are living faces, perhaps an elder telling a story, perhaps a child listening, perhaps words spoken in a language that has passed through many dangers and still survives. Perhaps the sound of wind outside the night, not so different from the wind that once moved through Beringia, through mammoth grasslands, through the shores of white sands. And within that fire, within that telling, within those people, the whole length of our journey suddenly finds its true destination. Not an ending, but in continuance. For the living legacy of the first Native Americans does not lie still in the ground. It breathes, it remembers, it is retold, it walks beside the present. And perhaps the most beautiful thing we can do as we leave this story is not to look at the past as something that has vanished, but to look at it with reverence for the people who are still carrying it forward, very quietly, very steadfastly, through the deep night of history and into today. And now, as those ancient lake shores, those frozen grasslands, those mist-veiled coastal paths, and those silent footprints at white sands slowly begin to fall behind us, perhaps you have already felt that the story of the first people in the Americas was never only a story of archaeology. It is also the story of human endurance before a world harsher than anything familiar to us today. It is the story of footsteps so small, yet powerful enough to cross an entire continent. It is the story of people who left behind no palaces, no towering stone walls, and yet left behind something even more extraordinary. Proof that they once lived, once loved, once protected their children, once kindled fire in the cold, and once looked toward the horizon with the belief that somewhere ahead there was still a land that could be called tomorrow. Perhaps that is also what makes this story linger so long in the listener's heart, because after all, history does not always begin with great names, but with the softest of steps, and from those very steps, an entire human world opened into being. If you have stayed with me all the way to this point, leave me a small comment and tell me which story you would like to hear next. Beringia and the vanished land bridge, how the Clovis people hunted mammoths, or what human life in the heart of the Ice Age was really like. And if you love stories of history, mythology, and science told in a gentle way for rest and sleep, Do not forget to follow and subscribe to the channel or fan page so you will not miss our next late night journeys together. And now, let those footprints slowly fade into the sand. Let the night wind close over that ancient world once more. And may you have a night that is deeply peaceful, deeply still, and a sleep that is soft and gentle